Welcome back to the CG Bros. This is Brother Damien, and this is part 2 of the session on creating a planetary atmosphere in Maya using a volume primitive. We left off in part 1 creating the shadowing effect in the atmosphere. Now, we're going to go ahead and take this to the next level by showing you how to replace the sphere fog shader that's assigned by default to the volume primitive with a volumetric fluid shader. This opens up higher levels of quality and lighting controls by enabling self-shadowing capability. Let's go ahead and get started. Since we've got our light atmosphere created, we might want to create some volumetric planetary clouds that live inside of or in place of our current atmosphere. So let's go ahead and duplicate the atmosphere and then hide the original. Select the duplicate, and under the rendering menu, come over to Lighting, Shading, and Assign New Material. In the Assign New Material window, click on Volumetric to filter the shaders, and select Fluid Shape to assign it. Select your fluid shape, and go to the Attribute Editor to tweak the settings a little bit. Under Container Properties, be sure that Keep Voxel Square is checked and that the base resolution is set to 10 to start off. Now, a good tip when working with any volumetric effect is to work at lower resolutions as you're beginning, and then kick it up as you refine, and only enough to achieve the results that you're after. But this will save you hours or days while tuning your shot, and when it comes to rendering it, especially if you render it more than once, or render it in several passes like I do. Set the size to at least 2 in the X, Y, and Z. This will ensure that we have enough headroom to dial in some edge fall-off on the body. Now go down to the Contents Methods section, and since we're not going to do any simulating on this, we're going to go ahead and turn off the density and velocity channels. Now you want to keep the color method on, and set it to use shading color. Come down to the Shading section to adjust the transparency, the glow, and the drop-off of the fluid shader. Set the drop-off shape to sphere, and here's the edge drop-off setting that I mentioned earlier that controls the fading off of the shader from the outside towards the center. And in the Color section, you can adjust the main color of the volume. Instead of using the color graph to create the illusion of shadowing that we did on the atmosphere in part 1, we'll use the self-shadowing capabilities of the fluid shader to create some real shadowing. Now for this to work, we need to go to the Lighting tab. And be sure that self-shadow is checked on, and if you want to see the shadowing in the viewport, that hardware shadow is checked. Also, be sure that this first key on the opacity graph is set all the way to the top. You can use the fluid's volume's internal light, or you can use a real one. The internal light is much more efficient to calculate and render, especially in cases like this where you're working with a single light source. So open back up the IPR and render a frame. Here we can see the internal light shadowing on the fluid shaded volume. And you can mess around with the settings for the internal light here. And something to note is that the shadow settings work for both internal and real lights. Now go ahead and drag a region around the area in your IPR to tune. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you what the real light looks like in the scene, so I'm going to check Real Lights checkbox. Now select the light, and in the Attribute Editor, open the Shadows tab, and be sure that Use Depth Map Shadows is checked if you're rendering with Maya like me, or Ray Trace Shadows is checked if you're rendering in Mental Ray. Now let's add some detail. Select the fluid, and open up the attributes for the Shading section. We're going to map a 3D texture to the transparency channel of the fluid shader, just as we did for the fog shader in part 1. By clicking the Map button and accessing the Create Render Node window. Click on 3D Textures to filter the shaders. Now, I recommend that you try all 3D textures here to see exactly what cool effects are possible. Now I'll select Cloud. Now, I might increase the ripples in X, Y, and Z. I might also reduce the contrast and maybe increase the amplitude a little bit. Now, you can kind of see where this is going. I'm going to go ahead and break the connection and connect up some volume noise. That's my favorite. Now I might increase the frequency to 8 and change the noise type to wispy. Now to really see this effect, check on inflection. And keep in mind there are no correct settings here, and when you change each attribute, you'll see the results in the updated IPR window. I love the IPR window. Now I could set the amplitude to say 0.7, the ratio to 0.8, the frequency ratio to 3, and I'm going to leave the depth max set to 3. That's how many levels deep the shadowing goes. Now I want the cloud layer to be tighter on the planet's surface. One thing I can do is to adjust the fall-off attribute of the fluid. This will adjust the density from the outside into the center. The other thing I might do is to scale down the volume primitive object itself. Now go ahead and select it, and set the scale down from 1.3 to 1.1 across the board. That should give me a nice thin layer to better match the idea of scale that I'm after. I'll also unhide my original atmosphere and do a quick render. Now keep in mind, you can also animate the texture over time, which looks great by creating keyframes or an animation expression on the time attribute. Slower speeds will give you the illusion of a larger size, and vice versa. And to finish up here are a few rendering tips. If you find that the edges of your shadows look a bit sharp, select the light and go down to the Shadows tab to Depth Map Shadow Attributes and increase the resolution. Standard resolutions work best here. And if you notice any geometric artifacts in your atmosphere, the resolution of the planet geometry object is probably too low. And if small black dots appear in your render, simply increase the fluid quality settings on the fluid underneath the Shadings Quality tab, just above the point where the dots are not visible. Now for really high levels of detail, or for close-up shots, you may have to increase the resolution of the fluid. And right now we have it set to 10, which looks good from this distance. But keep in mind that when you increase the resolution of anything, and I covered this earlier, the trade-off is that it will take longer to render. An effect artist's holy grail is to have an effect that looks good no matter how or where the camera is and moves. Something that saves them countless hours, days, or weeks of separate and distinct effect setups could be pretty valuable, right? Well, this is where the approach I'm showing you shines. It's flexible, realistic, and looks great. And it can be used in a wide variety of shots just by adjusting the resolution values of the fluid. Now, I hope you enjoyed these sessions on creating a realistic atmosphere and cloud effects, and now you can take your own work to the next level. I enjoyed bringing it to you, and I want to thank you again for tuning into the CG Bros. We look forward to seeing you again next time.